everybody. Good to see you this morning. We are coming towards the end of our series on the Flawed Faithful, and it's probably no coincidence that today, as we remember those who have fought and continue to fight for our country today, we come to a passage based in a time of fierce Old Testament warring and sparring. Caroline has been praying this morning around recovery from the cruel impact of war, for peace in our time. But today we're looking at a story that's full of conflict and brutality, so I'll give you a little bit of a warning there. Well, when coming back to read the story of Samson's life, I admit I felt quite appalled to discover that far more than a man of strength concealed in his hair and tricked by Delilah that I remember from my Sunday school days. There was a lot more there. The Bible Project describes Samson as the worst of the judges. His story appears in the book of Judges, being promiscuous, violent and arrogant, and we will unpack some of those in a moment. But we may ask, why is a man like Samson included in that Hebrews list of the Bible greats? Before we can answer this question, we probably need to think a bit about the context of his life. And to do that, we're going to have a look at this slide. I don't expect you to see this in huge detail, but this is from the Bible Project, the kind of overview slide. And it tells us that following Joshua's death, the Israelites fell into a time of spiralling sinfulness, oppression, repentance and deliverance. That's that little bit on the left. You can see it looks a bit like a target board. It shows that it was a spiral going round. And the rivals, the Canaanites, had great influence over the Israelites. Some Canaanites adopted corrupt and dreadful practices, like the sacrifice of children, for example, to appease their gods. And amongst the Canaanites was this group of people, the Philistines, a people group who'd moved into Canaan and had their own gods, and they are the particular enemy in the story of Samson. So at this point in biblical history, the Israelites were without their God-inspired leaders of the past, like Moses or Joshua, to direct them towards a lifestyle and worship which honoured God and valued others. And the Israelites had not yet begun to live under the rule of kings like Saul and David. So this was very much that in-between time of the judges, less like the judges that we think of in our modern day courts and more like warriors or gladiators. And there are a few stories in the Old Testament as challenging and troubling to modern readers as those around the Israelites doing away with the Canaanites, taking over their land. These actions appearing to be blessed by God, especially in this story of Samson. We might ask, is this the same God that revealed himself in the life, death and resurrection of Jesus? And how does this story square with Jesus' teaching about loving your enemies, or with his decision to lay down his life for his enemies? Again, the Bible Project gives some very helpful pointers. First, we must recognise that there is an untold story between God and the Canaanites that we only get glimpses of in the Old Testament. And by the time of the Judges, it's almost like God has run out of patience with them. This book, the overall book of Judges, where we find Samson's story, can almost be seen as a warning. And secondly, the Old Testament presents the Israelites as an instrument of divine justice. These wars are not depicted as battles for plunder or power grabs. Rather, the Israelite conquest of Canaan is described as an act of divine punishment or on an extremely corrupt society. And also, the author of Judges often uses hyperbole to show how the Israelites became progressively Canaanized with catastrophic results, and to detail the punishment that they received. Okay, so we come to Samson. Well, the last Bible great we looked at was Rahab. I don't know if you remember that Sal's talked about Rahab, and she noticed that Rahab is the only name in the list of someone who wasn't actually born into the Hebrew race. By contrast, Samson's story begins very much with him being born into the race, and more specifically, chosen to be a Nazirite. So we're reading from Judges 13, and it's on the screen, but if anybody would like to follow in the Bible, just put your hand up and someone will bring one to you. So this is Judges 13. Manoah, from the clan of the Danaanites, had a wife who was childless, unable to give birth. The angel of the Lord appeared to her and said, "You are barren and childless, but you are going to become pregnant and give birth to a son. Now see to it that you drink no wine or other fermented drink, and that you do not eat anything unclean. You will become pregnant and have a son whose head is never to be touched by a razor, because the boy is to be a Nazirite, dedicated to God from the womb. He will take the lead in delivering Israel from the hands of the Philistines." So there are similarities here, aren't there, to the announcement brought by an angel, a bit like the story of Elizabeth and Zechariah around John the Baptist, or to Mary and Joseph pronouncing the birth of Jesus. And the blessing here pronounced over Samson appears to be for the whole of his life, from his birth. Furthermore, he's given a purpose to begin the deliverance of Israel from the hands of the Philistines. Later on in this chapter, we read that Samson grew and the Lord blessed him, and the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him. So his story started with great promise, and God clearly had specific plans to use Samson for his glory. The next thing we read is that the now adult Samson was drawn to a woman from the rival Philistines, and pretty much commanded his parents to arrange a marriage to her for him. Chapter 14 says, in brackets, his parents did not know that this was from the Lord, who was seeking an occasion to confront the Philistines. And the implication here is that God is working behind the scenes, using even what we may see as poor human choices to bring his plan to fruition. A few verses later, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon Samson, so that he tore a young lion apart with his bare hands as he would a young goat. And this is our first witness of Samson's inhuman strength, setting the scene for an unfolding and bloody drama, wherein Samson puts out a gambling riddle for his community that he's married into and is tricked into being beaten. His retribution towards the community is severe. But again we read that the Spirit of the Lord came upon him in power, enabling him to kill 30 men, and as a returning blow, his bride is given to another man. And now we are beginning to see some of Samson's flaws, certainly the arrogance earlier mentioned, as well as a fierce rage. It says he burns with anger, precipitating a powerful desire for retribution where he's been shamed. The story continues with Samson's bride and her father being slaughtered, an increase of hostility and vengeance between the two tribes, right to the point where 3,000 men of Judah, i.e. those from his own side, went down to Samson saying, "Don't you realise that the Philistines are rulers over us? What have you done to us?" And handing him over to the enemy. Well, we might imagine that in the wake of this, God's favour would wane. But the opposite appears to be true. In chapter 15, verse 13, we read, "So they," that is his own people, "bound him with 2 new ropes and led him up from the rock. As he approached Lehi, the Philistines came towards him, shouting. The Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon Samson, And the ropes on his arms became like charred flax, and the bindings dropped from his hands. Finding a fresh jawbone of a donkey, he grabbed it and struck down 1,000 men. Then Samson said, "With a donkey's jawbone I have made donkeys of them. With a donkey's jawbone I have killed 1,000 men." When he finished speaking, he threw away the jawbone. Because he was very thirsty, he cried out to the Lord, "You have given your servant this great victory. Must I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?" Then God opened up the hollow place in Lehi, and water came out of it. When Samson drank, his strength returned and he revived. So remarkably, we see the same pattern of the Lord's Spirit empowering Samson with overwhelming strength and savagery, and clearly attending to his refreshment, ready for the next challenge. At the end of this chapter it says Samson led Israel for 20 years in the days of the Philistines, which kind of leads us to believe that that pattern was repeated over and over during the time that Samson, as promised, was enabled by God's Spirit to fulfill the purpose of delivering Israel from the ruling power of the enemy. Well, in chapter 16 we come to the most famous episode of Samson's life, his relationship with Delilah and how it led to his downfall. And this part of Judges would make a fabulous visual drama, even a comedic one, with the Philistine rulers hiding in the room, ready to subdue Samson, whilst Delilah asks him night after night for the secret to his strength, testing each theory, finding she's been tricked time after time. I don't know if any of you remember once Maff and Sue acting out this drama for an all-age service. Sue had her long black hair, a wig, long black hair, lying down, and yeah, it was very funny. So eventually, after several different ploys with new ropes and fresh thongs and hairpins and 7 braids, Delilah wore Samson down and got her extraordinary, generous reward of silver. So we'll read again from Judges 16. Then she said to him, "How can you say I love you when you won't confide in me? This is the 3rd time you've made a fool of me and haven't told me the secret of your great strength." With such nagging, she prodded him day after day until he was sick to death of it. So he told her everything. "No razor has ever been used on my head," he said, "because I have been a Nazirite, dedicated to God from my mother's womb. If my head was shaved, my strength would leave me, and I would become as weak as any other man." When Delilah saw that he told her everything, she sent word to the rulers of the Philistines, "Come back once more, he has told me everything." So the rulers of the Philistines returned with the silver in their hands. After putting him to sleep on her lap, she called for someone to shave off the 7 braids of his hair, and so began to subdue him, and his strength left him. Then she called, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." He awoke from his sleep and thought, "I'll go out as before and shake myself free." But he did not know that the Lord had left him. The footnote in my NIV Bible says, this is one of the most tragic statements in the Old Testament. Samson was unaware that he had betrayed his calling. He had permitted a Philistine woman to rob him of the sign of his special consecration to the Lord. The Lord's champion lay asleep and helpless in the arms of his paramour. So without the Lord's Spirit to arm him, Samson fell prey to the horrors of Philistine torture. They gouged out his eyes and set him to grinding in the prison, until the day a celebration of sacrifice was held to their god, Dagon or Dagon. Again, we'll read from chapter 16. While they're in high spirits, they shouted, "Bring out Samson to entertain us." So they called Samson out of the prison, and he performed for them. When they stood him among the pillars, Samson said to the servant who held his hand, Put me where I can feel the pillars that support the temple, so that I may lean on them. Now the temple was crowded with men and women. All the rulers of the Philistines were there, and on the roof were about 3,000 men and women watching Samson perform. Then Samson prayed to the Lord, "Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more, and let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." Then Samson reached towards the 2 central pillars on which the temple stood. Bracing himself against them, his right hand on the one and his left hand on the other, Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." Then he pushed with all his might, and down came the temple on the rulers and all the people in it. And thus he killed many more when he died than while he lived. So poor blind Samson, once a gladiator, is now forced to perform for the crowd. We don't know exactly what kind of performance that was, but we can only imagine his humiliation and the indignity of it. Now at his demise, we read for the first time of Samson praying to God with newfound humility. And God answers his cry, completing the purpose of Samson's reign. What a drama. Well, it can be easy to look at Samson's story as that of a man who is deeply morally flawed and really feel quite alienated from the barbaric practices of that period of history. But as Caroline's prayers reflected, we see similarly abhorrent scenes in our world today, of power wars and greed and human devastation writ large. And even though Samson was the worst of the judges, a warrior leading Israel for 20 years, he was selected by God for this purpose and was clearly propelled by God's Spirit. What does this tell us? It seems to be saying that whatever is going on in history, God can work through the most self-driven of characters to come against the forces of evil and further the work of the Lord's kingdom. I personally find that quite a challenge, as my instinct with distasteful leaders is to kind of look away, not to look for how God might be using them. And the time of the judges we've been reading about today clearly operated through chaotic and violent lashbacks without any moral leadership or systems of justice. But through bringing down the Philistines, it seems God was opening the way for reformation. But we can look at other more recent periods of history where active Christian movement has similarly influenced society for the better. I've been following, as some of you might do, the 24/7 prayer app, which has been quite topical on this. Jill Weber from 24/7 Prayer reminds us that the Wesleyan awakening, sparked in the early 1700s, catalysed cultural change in the areas of abolition of slavery, the establishment of more education and literacy, improvements to healthcare, prison reform, poverty and homelessness. Personal revival had a transformational effect on a nation. May it do so again. And I was particularly captured by something that Joshua Luke Smith said in response, encouraging us with this story. At Gethsemane, Jesus told Peter and the others to watch and pray. The disciples missed their moment, but I don't have to. Every day I'm invited to watch and pray. I'm invited to be watchful and become aware of the moment we're living in with godly insight, not in fear, but in faith. I'm invited to pray, to commune with God and pour out the pleading, the praise and the protest in my heart, not in striving, but in surrender. So, back to our Flawed Faithful series. In Samson we certainly see a man both fatally flawed and faithfully operating within the plan God had set out for him, even if that is one far removed from our ideals. Now the book of Judges concludes with the same line repeated over and over. In those days Israel had no king, and everyone did what was right in their eyes. In those days Israel had no king, and everyone did what was right in their eyes. It points towards Israel's need for a king and all of humanity's need for a king. And we know ultimately that need was met in the coming of our Lord Jesus, and through him the grace of God. We're very fortunate that we don't need to fear the kind of retribution we read of in the story of Samson. But even in our day, we can expect our God to prompt by his Spirit the most unlikely of protagonists. And further, we can watch and pray for how he is working out his purposes. So let me conclude with a prayer. Lord, in a world where wars continue to rage, thank you for the time of peace we are living through in the UK. But let me not become complacent. May I be ever open to the working of your grace, ever trusting that you are mightily at work, even in the darkest of places, through the most unlikely people and in the most perilous of times. Prompt me, Lord, to watch for how you are at work behind the scenes, and to commit to pray for this world and the extension of your kingdom.